When the world was young, everyone believed in magic. And because believing makes it so, magic was everywhere. From the littlest child to the oldest adult, every wish was granted and every desire fulfilled. There was no greed or poverty, no sadness or sickness. Everyone had everything they could have wanted. And then one man wanted more. It was an uncertain taste in the back of his throat, a bitter flavor that cried for something sweet to kill the aftertaste of something. He was not quite sure what. Murlock was an outstanding wizard, of the first order, perhaps the best of his species. His accomplishments were wide and far. The cockroach, he made it, and the fly, both small in the scale of things, but destined to rule all the same. Sturdy, persistent creatures that served a useful, though often annoying, place in the universe. The moons of Jupiter? One of these was his doing, though I can't quite remember which. Murlock excelled at everything he put his hand to. No one was smarter, wiser, or stronger than he, save one. That's it, thought Murlock. Why should I remain second to one? He had found his bitter taste at last, and he would not rest until it was gone forever. He planned and he plotted how he would ascend to the city in the clouds and assume the throne of He who is nameless, and remake the world, yea, the universe, into his image, and achieve the paradise that seemed so lost. Yes, even as he thought about it, he knew he discovered the secret source of pain and sorrow. His mouth foamed with the injustices he had to bear. He would not rest until he had exorcised the demon. It was a difficult affair at first. As I said, everyone had everything they could possibly need, so rebellion was a strange concept at best. Why, Murlock, they said, it's true that we do not reside in the city of the clouds, but we have all we could ever wish for right here. It's not enough, he cried, wild-eyed with excitement. Does it not plague you that he who is nameless has reserved the best for himself, while we are merely the footstool for his feet? Well, they had never seen such excitement before, and it intrigued them, and stirred emotions few had ever felt. Is it possible that he who is nameless had tricked them, and denied them some finer things of life? And if so, what could be done about it? It was true they were content. Perhaps this was a sign that they had been too complacent, too easy to settle. We're with you, Murlock. We know for certain you have never failed at any chosen task. Together our success will be greater, and our throne will be the universe. You will let us rule with you, won't you? Why, of course, he smiled. That's always been my plan. Quietly and quickly they began to recruit others who were less wise and less adept at seeing the obvious oppression they were forced to bear. It was quite an easy task, really. In his city in the clouds, he who is nameless would receive any and all visitors, but he never pried into their private affairs. A closed door or a closed mind were tolerated without suspicion. Murlock made a mental note not to be so trusting when the throne was his. 2/3 of the known inhabitants joined without coercion, perhaps 70 billion of lower and higher life forms, and the rest joined with various amounts of persuasion. Only once did it become violent, and since the victim was a member of a lower life form, and not easily missed, the campaign went on. One dull-witted wizard of limited ability and no culture whatsoever could not be recruited despite their best efforts. He was known as Gimbecile, which is where we get our word imbecile today. And another very powerful wizard, Michelangelo, was never seen outside the presence of he, and so he was quite inaccessible. Nevertheless, the coup went quite nicely. It began with the raiders, Oh, they liked the athletic sound of it. Taking control of all the major communication centers. It was imperative that they control the flow of information if they hoped to win the battle, both strategically and psychologically. Gimbasil was in charge of the city in the clouds, receiving and sending center. It involved repetitive assignments, which could be taught to one of limited intelligence. Even so, he had a quiet, wise look in his eyes when they came to imprison him. His workplace was clean and in order, as if he had tidied up for the end of the day. It made them suspicious, but he offered no resistance, and that was all that mattered to them. He alone had to be imprisoned as an unknown quality. Michelangelo, on the other hand, was caught in the Crown City Observatory. From there he could see all the world below him and every speck of the universe above. If he was aware, however, his preparations were ill-conceived. With one quick thrust of the sword, his heart was pierced, and he died at Gobloblin's feet. Murloc was not on hand for any of the naughty niceties. He thought that to prepare himself for holy rule, he must keep his hands free from blood. He contented himself with only giving orders, drawing his glee from successful reports. He who was without form was nowhere to be found, of course. Having no body, his presence was only discernible in the lives of others, and since there were no others now, he was as good as dead. Gimbasil was thought to show a glimpse of his presence now and then, but it was thought best to have he who was without contained in one such unsuitable specimen, rather than to destroy him and risk a greater incarnation elsewhere. Gimbasil was imprisoned in the heart of the earth, in the tower dungeon of the great cavern castle, and tortured, for reasons quite unclear even to his torturers. It was a miserable existence at best, but somehow he endured and a routine was developed. At dawn, Gribbirth was in charge of feeding and torture. The rack was his favorite. At noon he gave way to Labyrinth, who loved the knife, and the evening meal was often attended by Murloc himself. He often found ruling quite boring. Sleep had not yet been invented, but in the wee hours, volunteers took turns trying to keep Gimbasil from resting. As the only prisoner of 70 billion souls, he received quite a bit of attention. Being dead and far less able to feel, Michelangelo was spared this fate. Instead, his body was taken to what might be called the magician's equivalent of a laboratory, and to counteract the ancient prophecies of assembly and reassembly, they began to divide his body. First it was limb from limb, and then skin from skin, and finally they succeeded in separating each molecule, one from another. At that time they had not yet acquired the knowledge of splitting the atom. My, how far we've come. So they contented themselves with scattering his molecules throughout the universe. And that, my friend, is where this story begins. Harvey Kettle was so named to designate the high calling to which he spent his waking hours. As royal cook, just one of 1,000, his station and duty was to try and restore some flavor to the crown's soup. It was difficult to remember what flavor was. It had been so long, but Harvey had fixed into his mind that it was something that made one smile, a slight upturned crack on the corners of one's mouth. He could force the same expression upon himself, but that was not the same. So he spent hours, days, literally years cooking, mixing, and tasting, all in front of a mirror, in hopes that he would be the discoverer or rediscoverer of flavor. He worked by the light of the oven fire. It had been centuries since anyone could remember any natural light. Sometime earlier, no one knew just when things seemed to get darker, slowly. So slowly that no one really noticed until even the sharpest eye had trouble seeing their hands before their faces. Just a minor setback, they were assured. In the meantime, fire would do quite nicely. And everything in paradise seemed to burn. The forests were dry and brittle, a product of millennia of drought. And sometimes, for celebrations, Whole forests would be set ablaze to light the festivities. They never grew back, but the abundance was so great, no one worried, except Harvey. Wood was scarce now, and he had no idea how he would finish his job if there was no fire to cook with, or see by. He spent his sleep hours scurrying through forgotten passages looking for combustibles. It was on one of these journeys that he brought back the glowstone. He would not have noticed it at all, but his torch had burned to the core, and though he could not feel the heat in his hand, he knew by experience if he continued to hold it, his hand would blacken and become utterly useless for a time. So he thought it best to drop it. The torch fell into a morsel of water, a rarity in paradise, and was devoured. And for the umpteenth time he was plunged into absolute darkness. So deep he could not see his feet or the well, so down he fell. Harvey liked to rhyme this part of the story, though he was careful never to do so in public. The well did have water about an inch, hardly enough to cushion the impact. He had 5 or 6 minutes to consider all this on the way down. It was a strangely exhilarating feeling. At the bottom he broke his neck, a lucky crunch at that. He was able to set it himself, and in 4 or 5 days he was up and around again. He was just about to set off for the return climb and the certain punishment that awaited him for being so long absent, when he spotted it. Even a needle in a haystack would be easy to find if it was on fire. And in a world without light, this object was blinding. From a distance, it appeared to be another torch, though no one had answered his cries. For that Harvey was secretly glad. He disliked chance meetings with strangers. People did cruel and unaccountable things when they thought no one would know. As he drew near, he had to shield his eyes and stumble forward with yellow spots assailing his brain. At last he was able to grasp it tightly in his hand. Though he was unable to see it without blinding himself, he could feel in his hand a small thumbnail-sized rock, smooth and slightly oblong in shape. And even with his fist tightly closed, his world was now bathed in light, and his hand glowed a bright red. Harvey was overjoyed. Yes, he was. He felt a cracking pain across his face and lifted his free hand to investigate. And yes, there it was, a smile, right there on his face. It hurt so much he dropped the stone. He stood still for a minute, his eyes squeezed shut to sort out his dilemma. If he left the stone, he would have a long climb up in darkness, with nothing to show for his efforts. If he found a way to take it back with him, however, it could prove to be valuable enough to someone to lighten his punishment. Harvey turned his back to the stone and gazed down the corridor through which he had come. It was riddled with rocks of every shape and size, 2 of which looked like they might just work. One was round with a hollow place in the center. Another was broad and flat, palm-sized, that looked as if it could serve as a lid. Grabbing the rocks, he stumbled back to the glowstone, and after a few attempts, managed to seal it up in his stone box, with just a hint of light leaking. He now had his prized and portable torch. He began his climb, and almost 1 year to the day of his fall, he found himself back on the surface. At least that's what they called it since the Cloud City fell. The world below did not sound like a just title for the highest point in the universe. He rushed back to his station in the world kitchen, ready to thrust his find into the hands of the first overseer that took a stick to him. But as things happen in paradise, while being 5 minutes late can mean certain death, his year's absence had gone unnoticed. His station and everything else was right where he left it. He was greeted with indifference by the night watchman, and at dawn, moonrise, the overseer barely acknowledged his presence. He had escaped, and his treasure was still hidden. What to do? Should he report it? No. Harvey had never been good at lying, and to tell the truth, the whole truth, would risk a fate worse than death. No, however important this artifact was, it was now up to Harvey as to what to do with it. He decided to put it into the soup. After all, he thought, it made me smile. and in his half-remembered logic, smile was flavor. As luck would have it, this particular soup was to be served to the chiefs of staff, an assembly of 12 men who, as a council, were charged with making hell. Did I say hell? It must have been a silly mistake. These men were charged with making paradise a greater place than it had ever been prior to the victorious coup. They were failing, and they knew it, but they liked their jobs better than they liked anyone else's job, and so they issued long, complicated comparisons that somehow proved the prosperity of the current administration. By tradition, the prefect, Murlock himself, was supposed to dine with the council, but he had given up all quest for flavor and considered it a sign of weakness that others had not. He contented himself that the bitter taste in his throat was somehow softened by a smug feeling of complete and utter power. If the sensation ever threatened to become dull, he would sweeten it by committing some meaningless act of cruelty to someone less powerful than he. And since he had 70 billion to choose from, his days were spent in silent harmony. Death had never been so good. The soup glowed in the 12 individual bowls, but thanks to the great light in the hall, they were burning the peasant's house for non-payment of taxes. The 12 men did not notice. Everyone was halfway finished when the first man cracked a smile. And crack he did. He started laughing and could not stop. He split his gut and laughed at that. He went right on laughing when they tied him to his chair. And as I'm told, if you wish to visit, you can see him laughing still. The effect was the same on a more or less different scale to each, with such bellowing, screaming, and laughing that would wake the dead, with one exception. Carl, the dry one, began to well up with water in his eyes, and they began to splash in the bottom of his soup bowl. It's difficult to see yourself for the first time, if you have lived your life, a very long life, as if you never would. He drew his sword and would have plunged it into his throat, but the memory of his last visit to Gimbisol leaped to his new conscience, and he blacked out. When he awoke in the room of madmen, his remorse remained, but a new courage accompanied him to face what was and sacrifice his life for some noble purpose. He relieved Gribnorth of his dungeon keys, who in his raving did not notice, and he stumbled out the door. Down the twisting corridors he went, leaning against the narrow walls for support, until finally he was at Gimbisol's cell. He could tell by the screaming that came from within. With the turn of the key he was inside, much to the shock of the merrymakers. No one likes to be interrupted when they're fulfilling their fantasies. They rushed him. There must have been 30 or more, but they had never faced a man whose hands were unchained, and they fell like logs on a fire. They almost had him once when he slipped in a pool of blood. The ground came up to meet his head, and the fools rushed in to make him dead. That's Harvey again. But the first man impaled himself on Carl's swift sword, and Carl traded weapons with the dead man to finish off the few that remained. As in every battle, the cowards escaped, and the castle was quite in an uproar by the time Gimbisol was free. He walked like a man with a hump and one club foot. It was a miracle of ancient engineering that he could walk at all. Harvey heard the commotion coming from the dining hall, and he deduced his days were numbered. I guess I should say that as far as I know, no one has ever died in paradise. But an incarnation can take several days, weeks if there is significant trauma, and depending upon who or what your molecules are blended with, the results can be a very mixed bag. There is never a guarantee that the old you will be well represented in the new you. Harvey did not like the thought of a slow, painful torture, sure to end in a grisly death in a puddle of cockroaches or some other DNA creation. He thought it was time to check out. He plunged his hand into the boiling soup, looking for the product of his misfortune. Anything that could cause this much trouble surely had to be valuable. His skin peeled from the bone, but he barely noticed. His hands closed upon something round and unyielding, and he fished out his little stone light bulb. He wrapped his hand and treasure in his apron and bolted out the back door, and ran smack into Gimbisol and Carl. Carl lifted his sword in automatic reflex and was already bringing it down when Gimbisel grabbed his wrist. "He's with us." His firm grip punctuated the sentence. "Which is the quickest way out?" barked Carl. "The dumbwaiter shaft," Harvey said. "It hasn't worked in decades, but the rope is still there." And it was, what was left of it. Carl took charge. "When the rope gives out, press up against the sides to slow your fall. Try not to break anything on the way down. You first." And he shoved Harvey through. He lifted Gim up and then turned to cover their retreat. Just in time, too. Somehow Murloc had been tipped off that something was up. Of the little magic that remained in the world, he had most of it, and he used it to suit his own purposes. Now his purpose was to kill his former colleague. In the dim light of the wall torches, Carl caught a glimpse of black shooting around the corner. He barely had time to lift his sword when a lightning blast struck him in the chest. He would have died then if he had not been wearing insulated armor. As it was, the stink of burning rubber threatened to overwhelm him. He took one mad slash with his sword and jumped headfirst into the shaft. He could hear a scream pierce the darkness behind him. He went sailing down, picking up speed. 5 stories, 6, 8, 10, his armor throwing off sparks as he banged against the side of the shaft. He maneuvered his arms in front, thinking if he could only manage to save his neck, he could at least run with 2 broken arms. Kersplat! He hit the wine vat like a stunt diver, splitting the barrel and spilling out on the basement floor. "Good show, champ," Harvey bellowed, "but let's not wait around to see who's following." He helped him off the floor, and they were off again. Down, 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 through a narrow passage that would eventually lead them out. The scream raised in pitch and then suddenly stopped. Murloc looked down at his severed ear, ignoring the blood gushing from his head. The various ghosts and goblins, for that is what they are now, gathered around gaping in silent horror. No one had ever dared spill the blood of their master before. None wished to see what would happen next. As calm settled over his features, Murloc stooped to retrieve his missing appendage and walked slowly and deliberately through the parting crowd, down the corridor, into the dungeon, to the legion of dead piled on the floor. Once there, he began to sprinkle and smear his blood with the soon-to-be incarnated horde. He had birthed no sons before, but soon he would have many. And this, my friends, is where I came in. I am Griffin, and I ran the inn of Last Chance. My guests always preferred to remain anonymous, and like a good innkeeper, I never asked why. Every once in a while, 2 people, running from each other, accidentally ran into each other in my inn, and the result was quite messy. It was hard to keep the sheets clean in normal conditions, but never did anyone come to me who was running from the administration. After all, I was a law-abiding citizen, was I not? And besides, a man with a bounty could generate a generous reward. There was no reason at all for our 3 weary travelers to come to me, except for perhaps for my hobby of gathering glowstones. It had started some years before, I cannot remember when. Some wanderer from a distant province, desperate for food and lodging, gladly paid with one small, worthless rock. I was captivated, intrigued, excited, yes, happy. I put out the word, quietly of course, that glowstones will bring a handsome price, and they began to trickle in. 1, 2, 5, 40. At this point, my collection stood at 15,000 or more, and still counting. It was foolish to continue, trying to keep it a secret, but I was obsessed, and when I heard there were 3 fugitives with one small rock between them, well, let's just say my better judgment was no longer operating at full capacity. In my inner chamber, they produced the stone. "No, you can't. Not for one night's lodging. It's mine," Harvey whined, like his livelihood was at stake. "You have more?" Gimli queried. "What of it?" I replied. "You need not show us, but—" He paused. "You must place this with the others in a single room." "And if I don't?" I challenged. "Then you don't, and nothing will happen, and you can continue your collection for all eternity if you like." "But what happens if I do?" "Ah, he's interested," Carl ventured. Well then, Gim said, we have hope for paradise regained. Let me think on it. As you like. I trust we have bought 24 hours. And no more, I said. If you are still here after that, I will know who to call. Understood. They all nodded with silent solemnity. Very special guest, rate a special room. And privacy was in everyone's best interest. The floor was clean, though cold, and each had a blanket to wrap up in. The toilet was a hole in the center of the room. Carl had 1,000 wounds, whereas Gim had 1,000,000 scars. He scarcely appeared human any longer, save he consisted of a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. The tips of his fingers were gone, his ears and nose were just nubs, and all his toes were mangled, and his face was a knotted mass. Every bone had been loosened so much that he could rotate any joint in every direction, giving him a curious, spider-like quality. Not quite human, but then again, nothing is in paradise. Carl, on the other hand, was a handsome man, despite his wounds. Tall, broad-shouldered, a body that was well-tested and well cared for. Harvey looked like his name sounded, thin, frail, and somewhat ugly, even by paradise standards. I am older than them all, my last incarnation coming prior to the fall of Cloud City. I was conservative in my manner and protective of my individuality. I had no wish to die just to get a younger frame. Wisdom comes with age. Be careful how you dress my wounds, sailor. I don't want my DNA mixing with no rats. Carl was referring to Harvey's white uniform and sailor cap that he liked to wear while cooking. It covered his shiny bald head. Gim found a blanket and plunged off into a deep sleep, perhaps the first he had ever had, not interrupted by his own screams. What had happened to paradise, I wondered? If men could come to look like this, and if they stayed, would I soon join them? It was something I hadn't considered. But first to my vault. Each stone was contained in a separate tray, buried deep in my vault and kept from prying eyes. Never once had I yielded to temptation to display my treasure. How these men came to know of it, I didn't know, and I didn't too much care for it. I often had felt the urge to gather them into the same spot and let their radiance blind me, overwhelm me. But I am accustomed to resisting temptation. However, now the hint that there is some hidden value to their meeting, I'd often wondered. But could I risk it? Either way, I can wait until tomorrow, I thought, and these men are long gone on to their painless demise. No pain? Well, it's true, there is little pain in paradise. Not in the conventional sense. There are few nerve endings to register heat or cold, punctures or separation. But neither is there any pleasure. Try as you might, nothing feels good. Nothing tastes good. Nothing smells good. Nothing brings you any joy. Nothing but the glowstones, that is. Other men waste their lives looking for that vague memory of feeling, trying anything and everything to try to recapture it. Some slip into the pattern of continual death, perhaps hoping upon awakening one time they will not be, or at least not be, here. Others slip into the horrific and prowl dark corridors looking for victims that they can impose feeling upon, and they are the sickest of us all. I, on the other hand, took up the life of a monk, content to live without feeling, counting off my days one at a time in the quiet solitude of certainty that for all eternity nothing will ever change. Life, death, pain, pleasure, all are the same, all are equal. Everything is nothing. I was rather good at it until I got my first glowstone. It awakened in me passions I had forgotten existed. In some ways I hated them, for reminding me of what was, of what will never be, for causing me to feel again. But still, night after night, I found myself drawn to the vault, to sit among them, to smile, to laugh at the fact that they're mine and no one else's. Sometimes, if I am extremely giddy, I will hold one in each hand and drift off to sleep with the most pleasant thoughts imaginable. Green grass, blue waters, such colors, such happiness, too real, too rich to have ever existed. I wonder what would happen if I placed them all together. Would it mean riches or disaster? That night, for the first time ever, I opened every little cell, so the vault filled with a blinding light, and atop the case I placed my newest treasure. We would let the situation develop overnight. The banging at the door woke me up. I knew immediately something was wrong. My employees knew better than to rouse me this way. "Security, open up now." I was prepared. "The men you seek are in the upper room." "Lead the way," they commanded. I had sent a courier to the Security Council, taking precautions that he would be delayed in this way. The blame, if any, would be shifted from me onto my slothful servant. As for my guest, well, I had tried. Their blood will not be on my hands. They have only themselves to blame for being so well sought. The security force was the band of usual men. They had been here many times before at my call, save for one, shrouded in black and standing near the back, whom I did not recognize. Must be a new man, I thought. I led them to the top of the winding stairs. No way out but by us now, and turned the skeleton key in the lock. Click, and the door swung out. Empty. Oh, not good, I thought. I broke my leg on the way down, a little drawback to being pushed off the balcony. Whoever these fugitives were, I had underestimated the authorities' desire to catch them. They picked me up, dusted me off, and led me on a search of the inn. I could still walk, but only with a terrible grinding noise. We had been through the entire inn, and then with gentle persuasion they convinced me any secrets I possessed would not survive the incarnation they had planned for me. And that, my friend, is how we ended up at the door of my vault. By reflex, I shielded the combination from their eyes, but it only brought a low chuckle from the man in black. I turned at the sound. Laughter is rare in paradise. "Be quick about it," the figure snarled. It was then I recognized the voice, and my heart sank within me, for now I knew all hope was gone. Here stood a man that could not be bought, humored, or reasoned with. It was the devil himself, Murloc. The door swung open, and inside, bathed in light, coming from where? The glowstones were gone. There were 4 men, misshapen Gim, Carl, and Fighting Trim, and the cowering Harvey, and a little imp, about 2 feet tall, who had to be the most beautiful creature I had ever seen. He was a winged fairy. Can men be fairies? With a short beard and mustache, and his body all clad in armor. He was perfectly proportioned for his height, and as I looked, he was already swinging what looked like a long butter knife. "You!" Murloc shouted, and then lightning flew, blood, swords, and thunderous explosions. I was looking for a hole to crawl in when Gim thrust a sword into my hands. "It's too late to be neutral. Fight for your life," he shouted. It sounded reasonable, so I took off the head of the man nearest me. It didn't seem much like he was using it anyway. There must have been 100 of them, maybe 150, but save for a few, they fought like men that did not care to live. The fairy and Murloc were locked in their own battle, and the smell of sulfur were permeating the room. The little guy had been struck by lightning so often he had changed color, and his hair was singed away. But his sword was red with blood, and he didn't look any weaker. We were down to our last 30 men when Murloc let fear show in his eyes. He glanced at his remaining forces, sized up his opposition, and poof, in a puff of black smoke he was gone. He still has a lot of magic in him. The rest of them saw his grandstanding exit, and they beat a hasty retreat, dropping their swords behind them. Somehow the little guy turned out to be my glowstones come to life. Well, as much as we have found of him so far anyway. And that is how I came to be a fugitive on Pearl Mountain. Together the 5 of us are trying to put the rest of Glowstone back together, make contact with he who is, and recruit new members to the band, so we can retake the world and resurrect the city in the clouds. And that is how this came to be written. A lot has happened since then. Radio, television, space travel. We become to you the stuff of myth and legend. People have stopped believing, and that has made us so. But we are real. We do exist. We are still fighting, and our numbers are growing. Will you join us?